Good evening and welcome to a very special edition of Tysky Sour. It's been almost 5 years since Aaron Bastani released his video explainer on YouTube, Fully Automated Luxury Communism, and since then it has become a rallying cry for hipster leftists worldwide. Today, a very special day, is the launch of the manifesto of the book, Fully Automated Luxury Communism, by Aaron Bastani, co-founder of Enviromedia, my colleague, right here this evening.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you tonight, Michael.
Well, thank you for giving us your time on this very special day.
Actually, my first port of call was Michael Walker. I made it very clear when we were planning the promotion for the book. I said, look, whatever else we do, we have to do Michael Walker, Tysky Sour, every Tuesday. Don't miss 8 p.m. Enviromedia YouTube. How's
the launch gone? You happy with it?
Really well. I mean, the thing is, because you've obviously had, like you say, the idea's been in circulation for a long time. So the sort of pre-launch, the soft launch has been for a while, lots of pre-orders on Amazon and so on. I think at the moment it's like in maybe the Amazon's top 200 books, which is good for the first day. I saw it in Waterstones earlier, Foils, NYT article. So it's going well. I mean, obviously time will tell, but it's doing okay.
Sick. So today, usual format, we're going to go through the book. I want you to be explaining all of the concepts, and then I'll do some challenges and then your questions. So let's go through it. The order it is in the book. So you start off with, capitalism is in crisis, something that you've talked about a lot on Enviromedia.
Yeah.
But it's compressed. I think you name about 5.
Yeah.
So tell us about capitalism's crises.
Yeah.
And why it's only fully automated luxury communism that can resolve them.
Yeah. So the book's composed of 3 parts fundamentally, and like you said, the first bit is about crisis, and I call it the Great Disorder. And I say that we have the breakdown of our economic model starting in 2007-8. That was not a blip. It was not a cyclical crisis. It's part of a secular crisis. We can talk about that more in a second. There's climate systems breakdown, which consists of climate warming is one crisis I talk about. Another is, of course, resource scarcity. Resource scarcity can refer to diminishing stocks of fresh drinking water with the melting of glaciers. That kind of intersects with global warming quite significantly. Then you've got demographic aging, which actually in the short to medium term for countries in the global north is probably the biggest challenge. And then after that, you've got a few other crises. You could argue they're just one, really. One is automation, underemployment. And then an addendum to that is a crisis of what I call the global unnecessariat. So because of change in automation, the developmental trajectory of countries in the global south is fundamentally different to what it was 30, 40 years ago. So when wages in West Germany, Britain, the USA were too high, capital relocated to China, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, called the spatial fix. We know that happened. Now, the premise really from liberal mainstream economics has been, well, when something similar happens in China, they will have a growing service sector. They will have more domestic-led consumption. Prices for wages, the price of wages domestically are too high for global manufacturers. That will then relocate to Indonesia, Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, etc. And what automation means is that doesn't happen because rather than those jobs moving elsewhere like they did in the 70s, they're automated. So rather than the spatial fix, you get the technological fix. Now, for countries like Indonesia, Nigeria, that's a bad story because Nigeria population could be 400 million in a couple of decades, declining crop yields, less drinking water, all of those things. And then to compound all of that, like I say, a crisis of what I call a rising global unnecessariat. People who can't really enter sort of global commodity chains in a way that we've anticipated was inevitable for the global south over the last several decades as populations rise and countries develop. That's changing. So you can argue it's 3 crises: climate change or climate systems breakdown, demographic aging, and the other one really automation, developmental trajectory, or 5. In the book I say 5 to add some precision. Now fundamentally what I'm saying here, as well as of course the economic paradigm that starts in 2007-8 to break down, what I'm saying in the book is these are all existential crises to capitalism. Maybe because capitalism's, it survived for 200 years, right? People say it survived World War I, II, the Great Depression, etc. Maybe it could survive one of these crises. I would submit it can't survive all of them. And to offer the scope and scale of the crisis, of the economic crisis since 2007, if anybody's watching this and saying, well, that's not true. It's before 2007, US food stamps were used by about 20 million people. That's federal assistance for people who need food in the US. It peaks at around 46, 47 million, I think, in 2012-13. Then the economy picks up a bit and it goes down to 40 million. Now, in 2016, Trump was on the campaign trail saying, how can Obama have done a good job when 40 million people still use food stamps? And for all the talk of fake news, that was an entirely accurate number. In the UK, we have rising food bank use. In the UK, home ownership today is at its lowest level since 1985. In the US, its lowest level since the mid-1960s. Real wages haven't gone anywhere for 10 years. Productivity in the UK, more or less the same where it was 10 years ago. All of those metrics are unprecedented. And that's not even judging capitalism by the metrics leftists should be judging it by, rising living standards, etc. We're judging them by the metrics they want to be judged by, and they're failing. So those crises, that panoply of crises, I say is the basis for a great disorder in both the global north and the global south.
And it doesn't matter that much that this disorder is coming along, because the big fix is also coming along, much bigger than the spatial fix or the technological fix. It is a new mode of production, right? So you talk about free disruptions, three great disruptions. We're in the third. The first one is the agricultural revolution. The second one is the industrial revolution. What's this new transition we're in right now, Aaron?
So obviously it's a commonplace to periodize history quite easily, and people say, well, actually those periodizations are wrong. And of course, anybody who says that history fits into three neat periods, they're going to be contested. But fundamentally, human life doesn't change much for hundreds of thousands of years until about 12,000 years ago, the Neolithic Revolution. And we had the emergence of agriculture, domestication of animals. We understand practically, we don't understand how it's working, but we understand the practical applications of hereditary breeding in and out certain characteristics for both crops and animals. It's around this time that we develop wheat from 3 wild strains of grass. We develop chickpeas. We develop peas, I think. So basically, a lot of the common crops we now think of as like they've always existed. They haven't always existed, right? Yep. We begin to see shortly thereafter the emergence of surplus. And there's a good Marxist argument that says, with the arrival of surplus, therefore comes the arrival of society, and you then have the arrival of politics, because large social groups need to work out how they wish to distribute these resources, which isn't the case with pre-Neolithic hunter-gatherer.
And inequality emerges, right? So with inequality, you get inequalities of power.
Precisely. And you get institutions, you get culture, you get society, you get cities, literacy, numeracy, you get slavery, you get new sort of novel social configurations of humans and animals, humans and humans. And that goes all the way through, for me, until the second disruption, which is really the mid-18th century. Now, somebody might listen to that and go, how the hell can you say that somebody living in Babylon is living in the same paradigm fundamentally as somebody living in the 16th century? It's a good point, because somebody might say, well, in the 11th, 12th century, you have a kind of energy revolution with water and windmills in Europe. That's true. You have the arrival of the printing press. That's true. The Reformation's a huge deal. But if you think about Machiavelli, writing in Florence in the early 16th century, he's writing his discourses on Livy, right? How did Livy move from A to B? What was the optimal way of moving around in 1st century AD Rome? Horseback. What's it in 16th century Florence? Horseback. If you want to cross the seas, what's the optimal way to do it? Wind power by a sailing ship. Same thing. Heating and light. What's the optimal source of heating and light? Fire. Not much changes, right? The drinking water of 1st century Rome was almost certainly better than what it was in Florence and Machiavelli's day, or the same. So my argument is, fundamentally, you're in a similar paradigm, right? And then something pretty amazing changes around the mid-18th century. The emergence of the steam engine. We don't need to say what steam engine because it has precursors, but that's clearly the game changer. And the steam engine conjoins to fossil fuels, coal, and new ideas of a society, social relations, new ideas around political economy. And over a period, because clearly capitalism exists before the mid-18th century, right? Ideas of production for profit and exchange exist before then. But they all really come together. The new technical processes, the social relations, the new energy paradigm. And this creates a new form of society, which I call the second disruption. And that means rapid change. So in the mid-19th century, Jules Verne can talk about Phileas Fogg around the world in 80 days. A generation earlier, the same trip takes a year because of a really dramatic transformation in society. Eric Hobsbawm talks about this really well in The Age of Capital. And then we've got the third disruption. So just as the prior two disruptions are based around sweeping changes in energy, in society, in social relations. So for instance, where does energy come from in the first disruption? It's increasingly coming from animals, right? For travel, in terms of agriculture, you're using the organic labour of animals. The second disruption, it's fossil fuels. You're using the condensed solar energy of coal initially. And you've got the steam engine producing this surplus. And then for the third disruption, which I say has really been unfolding for several decades, you have another transition around what Jeremy Rifkin would call a technology energy matrix, moving to renewable energies, robotics, artificial intelligence. And just as the Industrial Revolution meant an ever greater abundance of mechanical labour, that's indisputable, you know. Try taking a steamboat around the world compared to rowing around the world. One's a lot easier than the other. What this means, this third disruption means we're moving to increased abundance for cognitive labour. And that doesn't even necessitate the emergence of a general artificial intelligence. It just means that pretty much anything that's repetitive can be automated, generally speaking, which in the literature is a lot of people agree on that. So the third disruption is about automation and labour. It's about renewable energy and energy. It's about the declining costs of information and what that means for food production, for healthcare. And so that's it. So we have this big change in a technology economic paradigm, which isn't new. It's been happening for a good 30 years, you know. The transistor is emerging in the 50s, the 60s, the solar cell in the late 50s. But it's only now that they're really economically efficient enough to really go just mainstream. So I would say that any socialist project, or even any social democratic project, any progressive project, needs to be situated within that understanding that we're moving into a new technological economic energy paradigm.
So, I mean, the periodization, I mean, that's kind of Marxist, right? He had the same thing where you had sort of like pre-feudal, feudal, and then industrial.
I think he had 5, right? Yeah.
Did he do 5?
He had like Oriental despotism, classical antiquity, yeah, but whatever, yeah.
But the controversial bit in your argument is that what many people in sociology would call the information economy or whatever, you're saying is going to be characterized by extreme supply. So we're going to have abundance in basically every realm of production.
Yeah.
Every different aspect of our life. There's no longer going to be any need for markets because we got so much stuff we can't move for it.
Would there be need for markets? Well, for the foreseeable future, there would be markets. But I mean, how do markets work? How do markets allocate things? Generally, under capitalism, you produce things for a profit.
Yep.
And the problem with extreme supply is it collapses the prices of things permanently. They get permanently cheaper. And the example I give in the book is of entertainment industries with film and music at the turn of the millennium. And Larry Summers and Bradford DeLong, two economists, say capitalism only produces things where the price equals, at a minimum, marginal cost. And if all of a sudden, so if you're able to distribute something for zero under the capitalist mode of production, that's not going to work. So you need, and they say market competition can't work for this. So we need to create, and they explicitly say this, and I cite it in the book in 2001, we explicitly need monopolies, enforced scarcity, forms of rationing. We don't know what the long-term solution is, but in the short term that will do. And my contention is that will increasingly have to apply to ever more parts of the economy, in healthcare with synthetic biology, in food with cellular agriculture, in energy with renewables, simply because these things become so abundant, it becomes increasingly hard to distribute them through a market-based system and the price mechanism.
And so that's how you relate it to Marx as well, right? So he's talking communism is when you have the end of scarcity.
Yeah.
And so you're looking at all these different realms of the economy where we're going to have post-scarcity. So let's talk about some of those, because I think that's one of the areas of controversy in the book, that you envision an economy where it's just as easy to make, I suppose, a new hamburger or to get a lot of cobalt from an asteroid as it is to create a new song on Spotify, or to share, well, not to make the song, but to share the song, or to create a new copy of that song.
Right. Well, they're two separate things, right? Zero margin cost says that the production of the song might cost X, it's quite a lot, but the distribution is the free bit. The scaling
so it's
up
the
is
marginal
the
cost is the different bit.
So, for instance, I'll give you an example in healthcare, synthetic biology, or even actually, no, with food, we can talk about cellular agriculture. So, cellular agriculture, this idea of synthetic meat and so on, how are they doing this? Or even if you're a vegetarian, synthetic milk. How is this possible? So you get a variant of yeast, you genetically modify it so it can basically scale milk.
Yep.
You then feed it sugars, you feed it energy, i.e. solar energy, warmth often, and heat energy, and you can scale milk, you can grow milk. Now in a capitalist mode of production, that's a lot of milk that can all be, if you're Mike Gapes, you must be really loving it. If you produce a lot of milk that easily, how can you capture all that value? And so if you're going to apply the same thing they did with Napster, the patent for the genetically modified yeast will be where the value is. And so a capitalist enterprise will say, wow, you know what? If you're a venture capitalist, you say, look, I'm going to give 100 million to this startup. And they'll say, you watch Dragon's Den, right? Yeah. They'll say, do you have a patent for this?
Yeah.
And the point is, that's where the value is going to come from. It's going to come from the informational content. And what Peter Drucker says in 1994, in Post-Capitalist Society, he's like a management guru, and he gets lots of things wrong, right? But what he says is that information is increasingly becoming the central factor of production, not land, not labour. And for the last 20 years, we've not really known what that meant. We're like, well, you can't eat information. But if you look at cellular agriculture, that's entirely right. The value, if you're somebody trying to make money in a market economy, will come from the information. It would come from the edited yeast that can all of a sudden scale the milk, or the Impossible Burger. It's made with vegetable proteins. It tastes like meat because they use heat. They create this thing called heme, which gives it a meaty flavour. The heme itself comes from, I think they produce the heme through, again, a genetically modified yeast. And if you're investing in Impossible, that's because they've got a patent on that process. So the future of capitalism, given that abundance, all of a sudden is about, and the increasingly central role of information in production. The future of capitalism is to isolate that information, make sure that's where value is coming from, and constrain abundance.
So where else in the economy can we see this kind of process already happening? So I think everyone who's watching this can understand the idea that before we digitized music, to create one extra copy of the album, it would cost the price it would be to make a CD, print some music on it, put it in a case, etc., etc. And now you can copy that album so that someone else can listen to it for free, zero marginal cost.
Yep.
Where else in the economy is zero marginal cost currently a reality?
So you could say Wikipedia is a good example of it. So Wikipedia is, and there are some examples of that in what I'm talking about. So healthcare might be one, right? Of literally zero margin cost. So you would somebody they have the Huntington's, right, or sickle cell anemia, comes from a single errant nucleotide of DNA. And if gene editing technologies do what we think they can do, you would be able to edit that nucleotide and the disease goes. And the point is, all the subsequent copies of that person, all of their descendants don't have that. So that does also apply potentially to healthcare. Where does it exist today? Wikipedia. Wikipedia is non-excludable and it's non-rivalrous as an economic good. And that's quite new. Historically, the idea of a non-excludable, non-rivalrous good, a good example is air. You can breathe all the air you want. It's not stopping me from breathing air, right? Wikipedia
non-excludable means you can't stop anyone consuming it without paying, and non-rival means that someone consuming it doesn't mean there's any less of it for anyone else.
Yeah. So, for instance, the use of a rentier system like Spotify is purely about excludability. How can we make profit through enforced exclusion, enforced scarcity? Wikipedia is a non-excludable, non-rivalrous good, and in many ways it builds on those same sort of tendencies of the decline of information to zero. Now, that's not to say it's free, because obviously people are putting in unpaid labour. But if you think about how much value you get from Wikipedia, I know I get a great deal of value for it. How much have you paid? Probably not that much. So that's a great example of how we're living at the moment in a transition where value increasingly isn't being captured through price, and there are forms of abundance out there that are being created which, under market orthodoxy, shouldn't be. The incentives for creating Wikipedia don't exist if you believe in what neoclassical economics says, and yet it's there.
And so if we were to move to, so I suppose if the state were to take Wikipedia seriously as a model, those people do ultimately need to get paid, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, you'd have some sort of foundation that recognises that this is doing something of public value and then potentially pays people for editing Wikipedia. I mean, because at the moment, anyone who edits Wikipedia is also relying on a job in the labour market, in the capitalist system, to feed themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's I would say the sort of, so I don't say we need a wiki state or something like that, right? Which is what Paul Mason would say in post-capitalism. Because I think those kinds of enterprises, you're absolutely right, they subsist off a measure of social democracy. And I thought this for the first time when I was in Denmark, in Copenhagen, like 2014 maybe. And you had all these food co-ops and communes, and there was loads of production going on outside the wage relation. There was loads of production going outside of capitalist relations. Why? Because people had free time. There was a social surplus that was being generated by social democracy. And it's a similar thing with WikiLeaks, right? WikiLeaks too. With Wikipedia, you can't create that kind of thing with your spare time, with surplus labour, with what Clay Shirky calls a cognitive surplus, unless people, if people are working 15 hours in a factory, they can't create that kind of stuff. But that's not what I'm proposing we do. I'm merely saying that clearly already around us, we're seeing emerging forms of production at odds with conventional accounts of how humans are meant to behave economically.
Yeah. So that's the more and more parts of the economy are going to be characterized by zero marginal cost. That means the price mechanism is going to break down in that area, and you're going to end up with a free product ultimately, which is why it's abundant.
Or, like I say, if you're a capitalist, you have to make things excludable, right? So if you let's say you're Jimmy Wales 20 years ago, whenever he starts Wikipedia, and you say, I want to make this thing, but we're going to need $10 million to start it. Somebody might say, that's great, let's make it, a paywall, or you need some membership thing.
Or just like Facebook, which shed loads of ads, right?
$2 a year. Well, precisely, yeah.
Or both.
And so that's the response. And you see this already in gene editing. I've talked about gene editing, CRISPR-Cas9. 2017, it's in the book. I give an example of a guy who's a biohacker and a dog breeder. He breeds Dalmatians. He contacts the US FDA. He says, I want to change the genome of my Dalmatians so they don't get gout. Can I do this? Doesn't hear back. A few weeks later, the FDA does a press release. We're treating edited DNA like a patented pharmaceutical drug. And that's basically what we need to be vigilant about. So it's perfectly possible that despite the abundance created by synthetic biology, the capitalist social relations intervene, and they say, well, actually, we're going to treat this like a patented drug. And for us, that seems strange. Well, why would you do that? But, I mean, that's the world we already inhabit, right?
Well, that is how drugs work, right? Because they have a very low marginal cost.
Yeah, exactly.
They have a very high price because someone's got a legal patent on it. So you're saying
Precisely.
more and more of the economy will function just like that, where there's very little labour going into the product, there's very little cost going into, the marginal product.
Yeah.
But the money is going back to whichever capitalist was lucky enough.
It's about the information.
Or smart enough, I suppose, to
it's about the information.
patent it at the beginning.
It's about the information. It's not about the labour, it's not about the land, it's about the information. So look at cellular agriculture, study out by Oxford and Amsterdam in 2011, estimates that, moving to synthetic beef and so on, you would see, I think, a 96, you can Google this, it's online, basically like between 90 and 99% reduction in greenhouse gases, land, labour, or water, etc. So that's a really great example of how information becomes an increasingly central factor of production. In agriculture, all of a sudden, you don't need masses of land to make beef, right? What do you need? You need that modified, whatever it is. I think it's generally a yeast to grow various products. You would need some modified biological organism by which to scale these things up, along with some sugar and some heat energy.
Let's do the luxury bit, right?
Yeah.
I think you touched on it there with your fake meat. But so one of the criticisms, sort of like your book receives, especially from sort of like green people online, is the idea that you're not telling people they need to consume less ever, basically. And to get to this point where people can have total luxury, you need some fixes, which to an observer who hasn't yet read your book and seen all the arguments laid out might seem a bit outlandish. So, for example, if we are going to be able to consume as much as we want with no limit, you think on the one hand that's going to be sorted by solar energy, on the other it's going to be sorted by lab-grown meat, because obviously meat at the moment takes up way too much resources. It's also going to involve asteroid mining. So can you tell me about that?
So, okay, there's a few things here. So first of all, we can more than meet the world's needs from the sun, right? So global energy demand today is met by solar potential hitting our planet every 90 minutes. Okay, let's say it doubles in the next 35 years, which it is estimated to do, 180 minutes, right? That's plausible. The point is, because of climate systems breakdown, we need to accelerate that massively, right? You don't need to be a fully automated luxury communist to think that. Secondly, with the cellular agriculture stuff, people say, well, look, we've already consuming 1.6 times the Earth's resources, and we're going to have more people. And I've seen David Attenborough make this argument. It means we have too many people. Well, actually, if we innovate, like I'm saying, in regards to cellular agriculture and so on, we can have more than enough to feed people 3,000 calories per person, more than enough. So you can imagine relative post-scarcity. You're saying everything they want. Clearly, we don't want people to eat everything they want. We want people to...
But no one has to change their lifestyle, basically. Everyone can live as the most gluttonous person right now lives. People theoretically could all live.
Yes, I think the average US citizen consumes something like 4,000 calories or something like that, right? Basically everybody could have the lifestyle of a wealthy person in the United States today on that basis. Although that's not what I propose in the book. I talk about the emergence of new forms of social consciousness and social relations.
Yeah, because they might not want to. But they could do if they want to.
We don't want people driving around like that. I would suggest let's have universal basic services, which are forms of communal luxury, like buses and trains, etc. But we can go into that in a second. But we could do that. You're absolutely right. In terms of the asteroid mining stuff, because then people say, well, I can see post-scarcity in energy. I can see post-scarcity in labour. But clearly you can't get post-scarcity in land. That's fair enough. We're not going to magically create more land. Although The Economist talked about fully automated luxury communism recently and said, well, once we start colonizing space, it's post-scarcity in land, which I mean, it's correct. It's kind of mad. I mean, presumably the guy read my book.
Well, that is similar to you, right? Except instead of land, it's resources.
Yeah. So if you look at Ceres is the biggest asteroid in the NEA, near-Earth asteroids. It's a planetoid. I mean, it has quadrillions of tons of iron. And one estimate says all the resources out in amongst near-Earth asteroids, all the resources there, if they were equally divided amongst each person on Earth, would be worth $200 billion US, probably more. Again, it's all sourced in the book. Goldman Sachs did one study saying that an asteroid the size of a football pitch, a US football pitch, could have as much as 1.5 times known planetary reserves of platinum. So what I want to say, and that technology isn't going to come around in the next 10 years. Right? That we agree on that. But what's happening is... companies, so Luxembourg has already set up the legal framework for asteroid mining. Companies are looking into the technologies to basically land on an asteroid and engage in finders keepers. So which is to say, it would be these asteroids or this wealth would be subject to private property relations. It doesn't matter if they can get it in 50 years or 500 years. The point is a tiny elite would benefit. And it won't be 500 years because Hayabusa, which was a Japanese lander, this has already happened. Hayabusa was sent to an asteroid, it landed, and it's come back with deposits from an asteroid. So we've already got the technology to do this. The question is scale. It sent another one recently, the Hayabusa 2, do the exact same thing. Would you like to know which country is sending a lander to Ceres, the most potentially abundant asteroid of all?
Is it us?
It's China.
China.
So clearly...
Fair enough. Bigger population to share out there.
People are engaging with these issues, right? And so I think it would be remiss of the left to just say, oh, this isn't a thing. It's clearly a thing. People are creating a framework of private property relations. There are active discussions amongst business saying about what should we have? It should be finders keepers. A senior US press officer, I can't remember maybe it was NASA, may have been somewhere else, earlier this year said that space is not a global commons, right? Because right now the Outer Space Treaty kind of says it is. Outer Space Treaty from 1967, I believe. Kind of says it is. So there's some kind of legal ambiguity around could you mine in space? So, the left needs to be at those races. And I think ultimately it will happen. The question is when. Well, what we know for sure is in the next 10 to 20 years, the rights of access and property ownership will certainly be laid down, I think.
All right, I'm going to ask you about political agency in a moment. But first of all, you're watching Tisky Sour. As you know, as I tell you every week, this is only possible because of your kind donations. So if you are already a subscriber to Novara Media, thank you very much. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. As ever, please like this video. Please share it on Twitter and Facebook. Keep your comments coming and make sure you are subscribed to the Novara Media YouTube channel. It means you get updates whenever we go live, which is particularly useful for emergency shows, of which there will presumably be more coming up, as we're due to have a new Prime Minister, aren't we? I want to talk about how we get there, Aaron. You've got a vision where fully automated luxury communism for the first time ever is possible, right? And that's because we can have basically abundance in all these areas of life. Society is no longer characterized by scarcity as it has been for all of history beforehand.
Well, actually, since the Neolithic Revolution, 12,000 years ago.
Well, there was scarcity before that, right?
But I would say that dialectically, the actual mental conception of scarcity only exists with surplus.
Oh, because there wasn't any conflict over it. Just sometimes, if you couldn't find food for 6 months, your community would die.
Yeah, I think that
But you wouldn't stress out that much about it.
You even see this with like the axial religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. The idea of heaven is effectively spontaneous abundance. If you look at the poetry of Hesiod, Homer, Hesiod in Days and Works talks about the golden days when, again, it's about spontaneous abundance. He talks about loaves of bread fighting amongst each other to put themselves in your mouth, fish that grill themselves and put themselves on your plate. And I would say that idea of post-scarcity is only possible once you effectively move into a society which isn't a hunter-gatherer society.
Interesting.
You can conceive of post-scarcity only once you have a surplus.
Once you have a surplus, because then I suppose is that when you only get the consciousness that you can have more?
Yeah.
Anyway, how do we get to fully automated luxury communism? So for me, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there's two fundamentally different futures that are possible in this story. So one is that you have capitalists who've managed to retain power, and they've worked out the only way they can continue making profits is by patenting all of this information, which is the basis of the economy.
Yeah.
They can produce basically as much as they want, but presumably they'll limit production to some degree to keep prices high.
Yeah.
And everyone will be renting all of the, well, not renting, but everyone will be buying all the necessities of life from people who've patented the information.
Mm-hmm.
The other one is that the information is held in common, and that means luxury consumption for all. So how do we get to the second one? Luxury consumption for all, instead of the first one, which is sort of like a rentier economy based on information hoarding rich people, fundamentally.
Yeah, so Peter Fraze, who I think you've spoken to before.
James did.
So Peter Fraze basically talks about this really well in his Four Futures book. And he has two axes, right? A right-wing axis, or a socially progressive just axis, and a socially regressive axis. And he has abundance and scarcity. So you can have a socialist project under conditions of scarcity, right? Perfectly possible. Where you change people's relationships, the means of production, but you have scarcity. You can have a socialist, according to him, project under conditions of post-scarcity, which would be fully automated luxury communism. I think he may even use those words in that sequence. You can have a regressive project under conditions of abundance, which he calls rentism, which is what you're just outlining, or a regressive project under conditions of scarcism, which I think he calls something like, what is it? Basically, it becomes like a death cult. It becomes like something like The Handmaid's Tale, right? And so I would say clearly the goal is a post-scarcity society which is politically just, socially just. And the means by which we get there is what you might call class war social democracy.
Yep.
And we can talk about why it's just not conventional social democracy. And effectively that is about ensuring that technology unrolls in a certain fashion, that it adheres to certain mental conceptions, social relations to nature, not capitalist ones. And that gradually this social surplus is divided up by the whole of society rather than a tiny elite. And so I talk about universal basic services, I talk about municipal socialism, and I talk about national investment banks to basically finance all of this.
Yeah.
And even for a social democrat, what I'd want to say is you need to understand, so the arguments around extreme supply, and I say, look, I think this could lead, or I think it will lead to a new mode of production. The question is when. A society beyond work and scarcity. But what this means even for you as a social democrat in the here and now, you might be a Corbyn or Bernie Sanders supporter. How's this relevant to me? Well, it basically means that universal basic services are more easy to implement with each passing year. So if you look at the inputs to a free universal bus system, right? UBS, free buses for everyone all the time. What are the cost inputs? If you want to produce the bus, the chassis, the wheels, etc., the costs are going down all the time. 3D printing, first stage rockets is happening, right? Relativity Space, Rocket Labs. You can go on YouTube, put in Relativity Space, 3D printing, you'll see some of the biggest 3D printers in the world. So the costs of producing the buses are going down. Because of declining costs of renewable energy, the costs of the energy are going down. Because of increased use of big data, the costs of resource allocation are going down. Because of automation, the costs of labour are going down. And we obviously have to have a democratic debate about, do we want humans to be driving? I think at a certain point it will be safer for non-humans to be driving. So right now, 30,000 people die every year in the US because of road accidents. If automated driverless cars means 15,000, all of a sudden that's a question for the moral philosophers, isn't it? You know, if you have a loved one, if your wife dies, your husband dies in 2035 and they're killed by a human being, I imagine you'd be quite pissed off. This is not, but why haven't we automated stuff? How the hell could we still be letting humans drive these, half-ton pieces of metal, right? Which is a good argument. So all the inputs to universal basic service of free buses are falling year on year. So even for a social democrat, that means you have a rejoinder to the argument that says, we can't afford this. Because extreme supply means actually we can afford it more and more all of the time. The only thing stopping it is capitalism.
So in what way is capitalism... So I think that's an interesting point. Because for me, one of the things I feel when reading about the political projects is that many of the proposals are fundamentally social democratic. The UBS, Universal Basic Services, the Preston model, so the Preston model is about localism in councils, many things that are part of Corbynism plus,
left
with a few
Corbynism,
extra,
right? Yeah.
a left Corbynism with a few extra ideas. And that the automated communism part, or the luxury communism part, seems to be, to me, a kind of like, well, we'll wait and see, maybe that will happen.
Yeah.
Because in the here and now, if you're going to justify free buses for all, if they ask you about the cost and you say, oh, well, don't worry about it, in the future, we're going to have automated buses.
No, but year on year. Renewable energy. So we're hitting price parity. Electric vehicles are hitting price parity in this country in the early 2020s. So it's already happening. The question is, so that energy being cheaper year on year, do we want that to go to the dividends of shareholders of outsourced bus companies, or do we want it to mean we have free buses? It is happening.
So that's about ownership as opposed to the services, right? So I suppose if you're saying, what's the point, what's the advantage, I suppose, of knowing this now? So if one of the things you're doing is kind of futurology in a way, so sort of like
I don't think it's futurology.
In the coming decades.
Well, because the central chapters of the book, I mean, I made a really sincere effort for it not to be futurology. Because I'm talking about.
I don't mean that in a negative way.
No, but I mean these things.
You're looking at how in the future technology is going to develop.
But it's already here. It's just not evenly distributed in many ways, right? So.
Well, we don't yet have the capacity to automate all the buses.
No, but like David Issue, for instance, with the gene editing stuff, and in regards to, we already have we obviously need regulation and we need peer-reviewed research, etc. But that technology is already here, right? PV cells have been here for 40 years. Lithium-ion batteries have been here for decades. So I'm not saying there's one technology which may come. The technologies, generally speaking, are already here. Moore's law's been happening for 55 years or whatever. Cellular agriculture, you can already get a synthetic hamburger for about $100. The first one cost $325,000 in 2011. So the technologies are here. So I don't know if it's futurology. I'm just saying.
But do we need to speed it up then? You want us to speed it up?
For renewables, you absolutely need to, of course, because you want a Green New Deal. And speeding it up means the price drops further still. And then you create that tipping point much more quickly.
And so should we socialise it now? Or because I suppose there's also a sort of two things going on in your book, right? Which is, one is that capitalism has actually been incredibly good at driving these innovations forward. It's capitalism that got us to this point.
I would say that's not true, but yeah.
You would say that's not true?
No, I would say it's not true.
Okay, go on.
I think that's a real ideological claim to say that capitalism's got us here. So if you look at rockets, the first rocket to go into space, 1944, not many people know this, it was a V2, modified V2, passes the Kármán line in 1944. The majority of the US space program in the post-war period was basically the V2 rocket. Wernher von Braun works on the Saturn V, the backbone of the Apollo missions. 1944 to 2008, anything that gets past the Kármán line, i.e. into space, is built by nation states. The first private business to be able to do that at the fourth attempt was Spacex in 2008, right? 50 years after the Soviets. 50 years. People talk about how backward the Soviets were.
Yeah.
Or they couldn't even put bread in their supermarkets. Well, in that particular technology, they were 50 years ahead of any private enterprise. Now, the point is, now space is beginning to become profitable, because space-based internet, potential resource extraction, etc. And it's the exact same story we see with the banks in the Crisis, right? You socialise the risk, you socialise the losses, you privatise the gains, which is precisely what's happening, for instance, around space. So your question about but lots of the innovation coming from capitalism, it's not coming from capitalism. It's
half of it. I mean, I suppose.
Give me an example. Give me a technology that was developed by market forces.
Well, not much of it was developed by market forces alone, right? But it's within the context. So the mode of production is capitalism that we live in, right?
And the taxes are then funding the research.
Yeah, you need a state who can fund primary research, which will then be developed into a consumer product, usually by private firms. So look at the iPhone, for example. We know that many of the technologies that went into it were from a state.
Well,
and
all the technologies.
They sort of partnered up to some extent with businesses who made it into a consumable product. That's a social democratic argument, right? So that's to say it was mixed market economies with capitalists, firms, and entrepreneurial states, to use the words of
none of the technologies, the jet engine, the internet, touchscreens, lithium-ion battery, solar cells, whatever the material science that goes into wind turbines, none of that has been developed by capitalism. Capitalism develops things for profit, right? For returns. Now, we've had a certain genre of capitalism, which is, by the way, the elite are trying to get rid of, which you're absolutely right. Basically, it said the profits of the private sector will pay for, amongst other things, R&D in the public sector, and that will drive innovation. The capitalist class of today no longer even want that.
No, true. But that's an anti-neoliberal argument, right?
But the idea that it's been capitalism that's created those innovations, that was what you initially said. I would say that the idea that we can't have innovation without capitalism is patently incorrect.
Say for example, as a thought experiment,
you're saying about creating mass consumer technology off the back of it. We don't really have a counterfactual to say, well, we haven't lived in a post-capitalist society.
Well, that's what I was going to give you the counterfactual, right? Because I assumed reading the book that you didn't think we should have had a communist revolution abolishing capitalism in 1917 everywhere, because then we wouldn't have had this development of the productive forces.
Well, we don't know. You might have. You can envisage a successful revolution in 1919 in Germany, a very technologically advanced country. I mean, the Soviet Union's a difficult one because, of course, it was technologically backwards, etc. Huge country, very weak national institutions. So let's say the revolution in Germany works in 1919. The Weimar Republic never happens, but the social mores, the progressive attitudes are all there in a socialist republic. The technologies that inform the Nazi project, the Wunderwaffen they created towards the end of the Second World War, jet engines, etc. All that technological prowess, the V2, goes into a socialist project, and that's perfectly possible that socialist country would have had the highest standard of living in the world, would have been moving towards it's the first to develop photovoltaic energy. It's the photovoltaic cells, rather. It's the first to develop the transistor, the microprocessor, the lithium-ion. That's perfectly possible. We don't have that alternative. What we do know is, to return to your original point, the profit mechanism has not created a single important innovation for 50 years.
Well, so a lot of the stuff you talk about, photovoltaic, panels. So these are the
solar
panels essentially.
Yeah,
they got made pretty cheap. Through competition, no? Through competition in the market. So what normally happens is you get in a university or adjacent to a university, you get some state-funded innovation, which is a sort of fundamental primary innovation, which then gets developed by firms into goods. Which is why, I mean, Silicon Valley creates some of the most sort of like forward-looking...
We're saying lots of different things here. Let's not talk about Silicon Valley.
Well, Silicon Valley operates within a capitalist system,
that's often oligopoly. I mean, so what you're saying about the stuff's created by, often we agree, state agencies, right? It could be the Russians in the 50s. It could be Bell Systems in the US, whatever. And then you're saying it gets cheaper because of competition.
Yeah.
I would say it gets cheaper because of the experience curve, which I talk about in the book, which is generally speaking, for the doubling of production for a manufactured good, the price of it falls by 10 to 20%. Now, the experience and the reasons why are pretty obvious. And anybody who's worked in a job knows that, right? Mm-hmm. Your first day in the job, if you're making cups of coffee, you're really bad at making cups of coffee. And then over time, you become more efficient at it. That's just one reason for the experience curve. Workers learn how to become more efficient. Now, you could say competition. I would just say it's the experience curve. It's perfectly possible that you would have a socialized financial system which finances worker-owned and cooperatively owned businesses to do the exact same thing, and the experience curve plays out in the exact same way. So I think, again, competition there is probably an ideological claim. Because we know.
Well, I mean, as a mechanism, though, it makes sense, doesn't it? Like the mechanism of competition, which means that people have to reduce costs. I mean, if you look, we have one example of a communist state, and they didn't make particularly competitive goods by the time of their collapse.
That's probably not true, but yeah.
Well, I mean, they didn't make particularly competitive goods.
I mean, they probably were producing... I mean, no, we know, for instance, they were making increasingly competitive steel, for instance, in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah, but steel, that's the whole point.
No,
they were quite good at primary goods.
Yeah,
they weren't very good at consumer goods that people actually wanted.
So my rejoinder would be, as information became an increasingly central factor of production, the USSR didn't adapt, no. So whilst the US was investing in the internet, in transistors, etc., the USSR was like, let's make more tractors.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's just a question of where do you want to allocate resources. And I don't want to get stuck in a debate about the USSR because I think it failed for a number of reasons. I don't think it's just because of the politics. I think it was by far the most backwards European country in 1917. It has a 4-year civil war between 1917 and 1921. It has what was a very marginal political party takeover, had 5,000 members in March 1917. Leads to a highly undemocratic form of government before the bloody civil war kicks in. You then have, of course, Stalinism, you have a huge nation you're trying to build all at the same time. So you have the Second World War, obviously kills tens of millions of people. And, you know, I just think it's a move. You know, why can't we talk about social democracy in Sweden and talk about the potential of where the Meidner plan might have led? You know, that's more in keeping with the hypotheses of this book.
It's not communism, though, is it?
Well,
I mean, that's why people don't call it communism.
Yeah.
They call it socialism or social democracy.
Right, so let's two things. Social democracy over the 20th century, what was its basis? Like you say, capitalist growth. Right, so if we're now saying that the era of easy growth is gone...
But it wasn't just capitalist growth. It wasn't just to fund innovation. It was working in combination with state agencies because that element of independence from the state and a degree of competition was quite helpful at producing goods that people wanted to buy.
The basis of social democracy is... yeah.
No, I'm just getting my phone.
Go on. The basis.
One thing we need to improve in Fully Automated Luxury Communism is the internet, because I can't see anyone's comments because I'm not connected to the internet for some reason.
Oh, crazy.
So
I'll answer. So,
I'm going to tether.
So my answer is social democracy, or the argument about social democracy, and this is where I think the third way really got it badly wrong. Right, the history books tell us that after the 1970s there were two alternatives for the left. One was something like the Meidner plan, something about increasingly subordinating markets to socialist production, or something like what Tony Blair does, right? Which is basically, we'll make a compact with business. It means that the economy has to grow by 2-3%, and that growth will mean easy credit, because you can keep on expanding credit because people can pay the loans because the wages keep on going up. It's a virtuous cycle, and that the high taxes from that will pay for improved public services, right? So that's one aspect of social democracy. Now, why am I saying fully automated luxury communism, not fully automated luxury socialism?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm saying the long-term trajectory of these technologies, particularly automation, artificial intelligence, means that two fundamental features of capitalism, or even socialism, decline. What are they? Karl Marx in Capital Volume 3 says that even socialism is still in the realm of necessity. That is to say, you still have work, you still have scarcity. So it's like capitalism. What have you changed? You've changed the social relations, the relationship to the means of production. That's what changes between capitalism and socialism. Working people now own the means of production. Danny Finkelstein, in a review of the book, said, you know, socialists haven't been able to answer the question, under socialism or communism, who makes the Twix? Well, under socialism, I can tell you, you finance, pretty obvious answer, you finance the takeover of the business. So the workers who make the Twix chocolate bars still make the Twix chocolate bars. What's changed is the relationship to production and ownership, right? That's socialism. Marx says, still in Capital Volume 3, communism, however, is an escape into the realm of freedom. So it's a society beyond scarcity, beyond work, where mental and physical work, where cognitive and physical work blend into one another, where there's no real distinction between work and play. And he gives that great line about being a literary critic, a fisherman, etc., all in the same day, right? And human beings can investigate their species being, because it's communism, right? You know, there's no real division of labour, not that much of that. And there's a similar argument in John Maynard Keynes, which I quote in the book, the letter on the economic possibilities of our grandchildren. I see 100 years from now, yada yada yada, we'll need to work a 10-hour week or whatever. Now, the core features of capitalism or socialism that can't exist in communism, what are they? Selling your labour for a wage labour, and production for profit or exchange. And I think the long-term trends of the things I'm talking about ultimately will lead to a new mode of production. And the handmaid to that is socialism, clearly. So I'm giving quite an identikit socialist argument about changing our relationship to the means of production and gradually moving to a new mode of production. It's not that new an argument, but that should be our horizon. I know you don't like that word horizon because it often means you can just say quite nebulous things. But I'm talking in very specific terms. Communism means you don't have production for profit. Communism means you don't sell your labour for a wage. With the emergence of general artificial intelligence, robotics, etc., ultimately I think that's a place we're almost certain to end up at. The question is, who benefits?
So what does, I mean, some of that was quite abstract. So I know Marx says we're not supposed to do cookshops for the future. But what do you think, I mean, to hazard a guess, or to you, what do you want it to look like? What does life look like under fully automated luxury communism? Yeah, so the book, people have said, well, you know, people will be consuming like they presently do, right? Which obviously under socialism, we can imagine what that would look like. So I talk about the UBS, you know, Elon Musk recently did this crazy thing, right? People probably saw this on Twitter.
the Boring Company, his new venture. What did he do? He created an underground paved road. The London Underground 150 years ago was a more innovative solution to urban gridlock, right? And that shows what's an outgrowth of Elon Musk's psyche is that he can, even with the most powerful technologies on earth, he can only imagine really basically the same stuff. Similar example, Nico Rosberg was in Dubai, former Formula One driver. And they're developing, they already have them, these air taxis, drones. Right? How are these drones happening? Because of, like I say, the declining cost of lithium-ion batteries. Stuff which even 5 years ago was like wacky is like perfectly, it's actually here now. So I would say in the short term, a socialist project says, this is crazy. We don't want Ubers for the ultra-rich which are flying in the sky. Let's use the exact same technology, cheap lithium-ion batteries, etc., to create a free, zero-carbon, luxurious public transport infrastructure, right? So we can imagine what that looks like, the next 10, 20, 30 years. However, you're talking about communism, you're not talking about the socialist bit. And this book is about the technological economic base. So Marx talks about the base and he talks about the superstructure, right? And he says that the superstructure, mental conceptions, ideas of self, relations to nature, emerge from the base. And this book, when it talks about communism, is only talking about the base. I have no idea how a human would want to live their life under the conditions I'm talking about. I can only see a trajectory built off the continuation of present tendencies, particularly around AI and machine learning, etc. So I don't want to offer that work needs to be done. You probably do want to think about the moral philosophy of post-work and machine control, etc. Absolutely. But this book isn't making those claims. I'm not offering, a lifestyle guide for the new person.
Yeah. But you're also not offering sort of like a different model of governance and politics, right? So I suppose one reason why people are
for communism
rightly suspicious of communism or opposed it in the 20th century was because it had an ambivalence or an animosity to liberal democracy. It only engaged with it in an instrumental manner because potentially you could mobilize within parliaments and in general elections to try and win people over to communism. It wasn't because you saw them as inherently legitimate and valuable. So I don't know how you as a proponent of fully automated luxury communism, what's your approach to liberal institutions?
I think it's well documented, isn't it? I mean, the word communism has different meaning in each place. So the Italian Communist Party, the PCI, was very much a party of the establishment by the late 1970s. Clearly, communism in Italy, if you talk to the average Italian, older Italian, it's going to mean something quite different to what it would mean in the former Soviet Union. And what we often forget is that communists in Germany and Italy were the basis of democracy, post-war social democracy, right? So people say the legacy of communism was Stalin, etc. Well, that's one part of it. Another legacy is the democratic institutions of post-war Germany and post-war Italy and France, right? The partisan movements were basically communist movements. Not basically, they were members of communist parties. And I think that's often sort of forgotten as one of the legacies of European communism is post-fascist democracy in really important countries. So in terms of my relationship to liberal institutions, I would say we need to fight for the programme I outline with UBS, with the Preston model municipal socialism, with socialising finance to help transition the economy to something else. Now, in the responses to the book, Danny Finkelstein, he makes that question, right? He says, you don't talk about 1917 or the failures of communism. I'm talking about climate change, demographic aging, or climate systems breakdown, demographic aging, automation, global unnecessaria. What are we going to do, right? And I think from a purely pragmatic point of view, I don't see how somebody can want to maintain a market orthodoxy. So then the debate goes between, like you say, probably a left social democrat and a radical socialist who wants to create another form of social system. I'm perfectly happy to have that debate. And you have to have that debate. Nobody has all the answers. But the idea that you can somehow maintain the status quo economically and address these issues, it's not happening.
I mean, no one probably watching this wants to maintain the status quo.
Well, a lot of people.
Do you maintain liberal institutions, a mixed market economy, and utilise the information age to make sure that there's public ownership?
What do you mean
over
by mixed market
information?
economy? What do you mean by mixed market economy?
Well, I mean, we're still going to have barbers. We still might have. We'll still probably have.
You're confusing markets and capitalism. You can have socialist markets.
What if you socialise finance?
Yeah, so that's the path. That's the argument in the Preston model.
Well, but most people call that market socialism as opposed to. I mean, the Preston model isn't communism. So the Preston model is a form of market socialism potentially.
Potentially could be, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm all in favour of market socialism. I'm bang into it.
So you have the barbers; they're just owned by the workers, and they finance the growth of the business through socialised finance,
which is market socialism.
Yeah,
there's still scarcity. There isn't just an abundance of.
Yeah, but you would say you're talking. That wasn't what you just said. You said a mixed market economy.
That is a mixed market economy.
What? If some goods and services are provided by publicly owned institutions, universal basic services, which I would say really are human rights, right? And other things are almost certainly provided by worker-owned business. Is that a mixed market economy? I don't think it's a mixed market economy. Historically means publicly owned, privately owned.
But the barbers is privately owned.
I
think you'd potentially have some businesses which are privately owned and quite large, right? So you'd have a variety of cooperatives, some private ownership, and I think socialised finance, go for it. But
the public-private distinction is generally talking about production for profit and production for social value, and so I think maybe
people can still produce for profit in a world with socialised finance.
Of course they can.
That's the whole point, because you still got the profit motive, which is why the people who are in favour of market socialism thought you'd have the same innovation that you got in capitalist societies, but you could have it in a market socialist society, which no one really called communism, right? Because you still have
we've never really
scarcity,
had market
you still have
societies.
competition. No, we haven't. But I mean, it would be a bit idiosyncratic to call that communism, right?
Well, I'd never say that's communism. I say that's the transitional stage with the UBS, with the Preston model, etc. And like I say, the communism is coming from looking at where does AI, machine learning, etc. end up. It attenuates a fundamental. Let's define capitalism here. Some people think capitalism's existed since time immemorial. It's like a fundamental. It's in the DNA of human beings. It's a socially contingent system. It has a beginning, it has an end. It began more or less in the early 19th century, but it's production for profit. It's selling your labour for a wage.
Mm-hmm.
Under feudalism, you don't sell your labour for a wage. You have a feudal lord. You have to work for him until you die. You're effectively his property. Those social relations abided in Russia until the 1850s, right? So what I'm saying is, just as those forms of social relation were very determinate and historically contingent, they dissolved. If we look at some of the things in the future that I talk about in the book, they will dissolve as well. And the path to that is a form of, in your own words, Michael, I think it's in the book even, class war social democracy.
Yeah.
Classical democratic socialist project.
Final question from me, and then I'm going to go to the audience. So, I mean, the book, the middle bit, I mean, the whole book's great. I really enjoyed it. You should definitely buy it. You should definitely read it. Is laying out how in all these different spheres we can achieve abundance. So how we can have extreme supply in food, extreme supply in energy, extreme supply in labour, extreme supply in resources, etc., etc. Now, I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty of whether each of these arguments is persuasive on its own terms. I just want to say, hypothetically, what if one of these fails? So you've laid out the idea that we could have, for example, I think resources is the most likely to fail, right? So you've laid out how potentially we could have unlimited resources by mining asteroids. But if it turns out that lots of these technologies, which you've talked about, ultimately fail, I mean, we know that there have been many projects in the past which seem at the brink of fruition, but then go nowhere.
Yep.
So say asteroid mining goes nowhere, and we end up in a situation where we don't have post-scarcity in resources. What impact does that have on your overall argument?
So two things. So I think one, if we were to have very high levels of artificial intelligence and automation, and very high levels of efficiency with regards to renewables, asteroid mining is an outgrowth of that. So I think the second you can have basically a machine which can imitate what a human does, the second you can have energy efficiency from renewables that can travel around the solar system, asteroid mining kind of becomes inevitable, right? Basically, once those two things are done. So I look at them all as kind of interlinked. However, let's just presume it doesn't, because you're quite right to say renewables seems almost certain, just not quickly enough. We look at the sort of revolution in robotics, machine learning, etc., synthetic biology, so that all seems to be happening. So let's say asteroid mining can't happen. If we transition to renewable energies, I think, and we double global energy consumption, we just about have enough lithium to use renewables for all of global energy. However, we would have to constantly recycle all known global lithium reserves, right? And that may happen. But we know from the sort of history tells us that what will be far more likely is resource wars over lithium, right? That's far more likely. What I would say is that you're underestimating in that account the increasingly central role of information. So I'll give you an analogy. In the 1st century AD, there's a great anecdote, I can't remember which Roman historian talks about this, of a silversmith. He gives a plate to a king, and it looks like silver. and he gives it to the king. It's incredibly light, and the king can't believe how light it is, and he beheads the guy. And it turns out it's aluminium, right? But we didn't really. This is before modern aluminium was produced. Similar story. The king of Siam is given aluminium plates by, I think, Napoleon III. Michael?
I'm looking at questions now.
I know, but you got to. I know. If you're not listening to the answer, I don't know.
Oh right, sorry. I wasn't listening to the answer because I was collecting questions at this point. You were speaking.
So he's giving him aluminium.
effer.
So aluminium was a very precious metal until the mid 19th century. Then all of a sudden we work out a new process. By the way, bauxite is the third most abundant material on Earth, and you make aluminium from bauxite. Today, aluminium goes into that can you're carrying. Right? That was once upon a time a very precious metal. And I would say the increasingly central role from information means that the successor technologies to things like PV cells, which will happen, right? So the idea that PV cells is the end of the story, photovoltaic cells is the end of the story, they only convert about 30% of the energy to electricity, right? It's perfectly, not even possible, very likely will produce things far more efficient than that, and forms of storage far more efficient than lithium-ion batteries. I don't want to get into the thing of, well, I can't guarantee that, can I? But if we look at the story of the last several hundred years, I mean, it seems almost certain. For instance, if you look at an LED, I think is 500,000 times more energy efficient per lumen than like just fire. So that level of efficiency is kind of amazing. And the question is how far it goes. So even if we have abiding conditions of scarcity, and let's say technological innovation slows down, I think when it comes to pretty much the fundamentals of life, and certainly UBS, we would still have, it wouldn't be, you're right, it wouldn't be a post-scarcity society, but then we would ask the question, well, what is where do we have post-scarcity? And I would say that the project then becomes one of pools of scarcity and post-scarcity in society, or pools of abundance, which should be subject to common ownership. So if I leave my pen here, or my debit card, right? I leave my debit card here. Right now, it's a means of taking money out. It's like an amazing little gadget. And I go home on the train, oh, I forgot my card, or I lost my card, I can cancel my card, oh, well, I've got other pens. That's not post-scarcity of pens, right? But the thing is, it's so easy to access, you can just get another one. And so, increasingly, you would want pools of abundance that look like that. Healthcare, for instance, with gene editing, etc., subordinated to projects of social justice. Oh, I've got this illness, fine, you can sort this out. Or with food, declining costs of things you wouldn't even think about. For instance, a Wagyu steak. Today, a Wagyu steak costs hundreds of dollars. A Wagyu steak under conditions of extreme supply might be 10p. It's not post-scarcity, but it's so cheap you're not really thinking about it. And so I would say that's the most conservative picture we should have, given the technologies we're looking at and surveying.
And your argument is that the only thing stopping a delicious steak being consumed as flippantly as we consume a lighter or lose a lighter is capitalists who are trying to control information and stopping it being free.
A Wagyu steak will be as accessible as a cheap biro within not very long. I would argue, yes.
Put a date on it.
I mean, the thing is, the technology's already... No. People didn't even know you could create cultured meat, synthetic meat. It was actually written down in 2008 by a guy called Mark Post. And he said, I think you can probably create cultured meat by doing this. 2008. It's then done for the first time in 2011. The first hamburger, like I say, is $325,000. Today, a burger is $100. So this was a technology which we only worked out 11 years ago. So 11 years from now, this is really rapid progress. Really, really, really rapid. The same with CRISPR-Cas9. CRISPR-Cas9 and gene editing, gene sequencing as well. First human genome sequenced, I think, in 2002, 2003, at a cost of billions and billions, $3 billion, I think. Today, you can get your genome sequenced for $1,000. Now, somebody might say, well, what does that matter? Why do I care about my genome being sequenced? Well, what's interesting is tumours also have a genome, believe it or not. It's like a baby. You could have your blood tested for the genome of a tumour. And if the costs of gene sequencing continue to collapse, 10, 15 years from now, cost of sequencing a gene might be the same, a genome might be the same as a Mars bar, right? Or it might be cheaper, it might be like flushing a toilet. At which point you can have your biology sequenced every week, and all of a sudden you get to detect cancer at stage 0 effectively, right? Before any modern medical tool of observation be able to find it, this could. And all of a sudden you can find cancer at stage 0, which is a really remarkable innovation. So, and that could be 10 years away, you know. The Wagyu steak being ultra cheap could be 10 years away. That's really here. Electric vehicles on price parity with fossil fuel cars, early 2020s. We're not talking about 30, 40 years in the future.
All right, let's go some questions. Michael McCrafe. What could housing policy look like under Falk? Would private 3D printed homes or more communal forms of living be preferable, or some combination? What could hotels' travel accommodation look like?
Oh, well, let's start with hotels. So I think Airbnb is a classic example of the failure of late capitalism. And Nick Cernek talks about this in Platform Capitalism. If you're looking at productivity, right? If you're measuring the amount of output per hour worked, Airbnb is massively inefficient compared to a hotel. And people, because it's slightly cheaper, people are like, oh, Airbnb is great. Wouldn't you rather stay at like a luxury, ultra cheap hotel in the middle of town, right? Where there's no noise, no mucking about with this landlord, no hateful neighbours. And if you think about the inputs that go into it, again, the experience curve, workers who are working in the reproduction of a hotel, they get these things we talk about, the experience curve, right? So they get ultra efficient at being able to do all the identical rooms that are the same. They get ultra efficient at maintaining them and keeping them and cleaning them, etc. So actually, it's more efficient in terms of per hour worked to have a hotel than Airbnb. Airbnb is a very inefficient way of using human labour. So I would say you want some form of publicly owned leisure infrastructure, which would be, you know, freely available, very cheap. So I think Airbnb is a classic example, actually, of how the digital revolution is serving some people, but really for the rest of us, we're getting a really bum deal. Airbnb is a terrible product. You know, wouldn't you rather have Premier Inn, but even nicer? Well, that's pretty nice to be fair, and very, very cheap.
That's quite a good example there, right? Because people will still be working in that hotel. I mean, is the idea that you'll have highly productive cleaners, so they get paid a very, very decent wage and only work 10 hours a week or something.
So the book talks about this. It's called Moravec's Paradox, right, in the book, which is to say we always historically thought that the most cognitively demanding tasks, like playing chess and so on, would be the last to be automated. But it turns out, or mathematics, it turns out they're the first to be automated, right? We know that a computer beat Garry Kasparov, Deep Blue, more than 15 years ago, I think. But Moravec's Paradox says, surprisingly, counterintuitively, that the last things to be automated will be things like fine motor coordination, right? So you can create a robot that beats Garry Kasparov well before you create a robot that can clean the dishes.
Yeah, or change a pillowcase. That's
right,
exactly. Pretty hard.
Yeah, no, it is. So what's interesting, and this has consequences for labour organising, what's interesting is that many low-skill service jobs, like a cleaner, they will be amongst the last to be automated. They'll be automated long after accountants and lawyers, etc., or most accountants and most lawyers, because it's primarily about fine hand-eye coordination, motor coordination, etc. So they will be the last to be automated. They should be earning great money. They should be in unionised jobs. And that's a lesson for the labour movement, which is to say, yes, much of the labour market's going to be automated away. Where is it going to stay? Where's it going to grow? Growth sectors are care work because of geriatric change, ageing populations. Again, the last to be automated. Maybe automated, right? You may get like a ex machina style robots which literally look and act just like humans. Possible. You know, it's not against the laws of physics. So potentially, but that will be the last wave of automation. It probably won't happen in our life.
Who else? This isn't a question. This is my question now. I'm going to go back to them in a second. Who stands between us and fully automated luxury communism other than elites? So in the book, it's sort of, it seems like there's the masses. The only thing standing in between the masses and this beautiful, gorgeous future is a small group of capitalists who want to patent information and stop it being free. Is there any other social group or is there any other political force which you see as standing in the way and intervening to stop Falk happening?
Who asked that?
That was my own. Sorry, I'm abusing the position again.
Politics is always contextually specific, right? So it depends what country you're in, of course. But in Britain, I mean, we can talk about...
Sorry, I was looking at the questions again. Yeah, go on.
No, it's contextually specific. So
let's look in Britain.
Yeah, so in Britain, who would want to stop it?
Who wants to stop this other than the 1% who own the patents?
Well, you've got the British deep state. You've got various people who have a very vested interest in land ownership in this country, etc., etc. That's going to be very different to Saudi Arabia or to Russia. Saudi Arabia probably won't be, people won't be able to live there in 30 years because of climate systems.
I suppose I'm more talking about other cleavages in society, so sort of like other bases
in Britain.
for well anywhere. I mean, really. So
okay. So I've got an answer.
Well, so the question is, even if we get to this period of relative post-abundance, or possible post-abundance, as it were, that's not going to dissolve all other conflicts in society, and so we could see new bases of conflicts, which make the future not particularly nice.
So a few things. It depends what happens. So first of all, it's the people that own the means of production. It's people that own assets, rentiers, etc. But let's look into the future. Climate change, right? You're going to see massive changes in migration patterns. It's actually, the far right have a ready-made ideology to take off the shelf in terms of the breakdown of globalization, relocalizing economies, etc., etc. Ready to take off the shelf. So in the context of climate breakdown, I would say right-wing nativism as well, which is why you need an international project. But it's not an international project which is about no borders. Mm-hmm. I personally think anybody should be able to live where they like, but also people have the right to remain in somewhere, right? So you have the right to remain in the country you lived in if you want to. And I think that the former discourse too easily says, well, give up on sub-Saharan Africa, give up on California, give up on the Middle East. And actually, no, the global north needs to be funding processes whereby we try to mitigate climate change in these places as much as possible. Don't just give up on them.
All right, if I haven't answered your question, keep asking them and put that rocket on, just like Gary told you to. If it's got the rocket emoji, I'm more likely to see it. I love this question from Average Joe. On a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being dystopia and 10 being utopia, where on that scale are we now?
Depends what country you're in.
Here right now.
Well, it depends who you are. I mean, I tell you what, I talk about in the book about Elysium, the film Elysium. Mm-hmm. And I think Elysium is a film about rights of access. Who gets to access the healthcare? There's the med bays. They have relative post-scarcity regarding health, right? These med bays are phenomenal. But who gets to access them? And okay, we're not there yet, but that's really a story right now that we're living in Europe. So in 2015, December 2015, Spacex successfully landed the first autonomously piloted first stage rocket, right? This rocket landed itself. 2.5 months earlier, Alan Kurdi, a 3-year-old boy, his corpse was washed up on a beach in Bodrum, right? And they were fleeing Syrian Kurdistan. So yes, Elysium is a film, but we already have a planet where we can sequence the genome of every organism on Earth. We already have a planet of self-piloting first-stage rockets, but it's the same planet where a 3-year-old dies on a beach and they drown to death with their mother and their brother. So dystopia is here for many, many people. I mean, it's not here for you and I. In terms of my life, I'd probably give it a 7 out of 10, globally speaking, 8 out of 10. We're obviously in a minority. And the question is, how far will dystopia stretch in the near future and for how many people? If climate change is as bad as we think, and if people don't act decisively now, the vast majority of the Earth will be living in something that's just pretty abject.
This is from Mats Andreas Nielsen. Can you lay out your argument against UBI, so Universal Basic Income? Is that argument one also made against Cernick and Williams' vision in inventing the future?
I mean, I'm not here to dismiss UBI. I think there's a great line in a Jacobin article about UBI, and I'd suggest people read it. And it says, an affordable UBI is an effective UBI is unaffordable. And I think that's probably true. I would say, let's argue for UBS first. Why? Firstly, it's strategically smart. It's something that people already recognise, like nationalisation, public ownership. Secondly, we have these great crises, ageing, climate change, etc. UBS will be better at mitigating those challenges than a UBI more quickly. And then thirdly, we just don't know if UBI works. It needs lots of modelling. Although I imagine the data suggests the UBI will be more effective in global South countries than global North countries. So that's not to say it won't work anywhere. If you're a small country, a very poor small country, a UBI might be very effective, right? Or if you're Malta, 300,000 people, small economy, because you're an island, generally speaking, most stuff's going to be produced locally. A UBI could work. Could a UBI work necessarily in the United States or in the UK? I don't know. I think a UBS in these big countries would be far more effective and far more easy to argue as a leftist.
I mean, for me, if you're looking at a Western developed country, it's just further down the line. And I think that's based on how much you think markets are going to be involved in society, right? So I'd, in my radical social democratic future, I'd have UBS, Universal Basic Services. Yeah. And then once you've abolished rentiers because you don't want your universal basic income just to go to landlords, then that's when you introduce a UBI that people can use to buy consumer goods, to go get their hair cut, to go to the cafe. Because I think we still will have many areas of life which are market-based, and therefore
that's highly possible.
UBI is a reasonable way to provide people that choice to engage in society in that way.
If Labour took power in this country, they should absolutely undertake pilots for UBI. Absolutely. But I just think, first term, you would want to do UBS first.
Oh, this is from Gary. Will AI replace government? Will artificial intelligence replace government?
Well, this is a question. Well, first of all, I mean, Paul Mason puts it really well in his present book, right? We've deferred for 35 years this thing called the market. Can we do this thing? No, the market says we can't. Why? Well, the market says we can't. How is that any different to a machine? How is that any subordinating? You're saying this protocol, this set of rules, which is solidified and this institution says no. That's no different fundamentally to machine control, because it's taking agency away from human beings. It's depoliticizing the political. So in a sense, that's already here, certainly in sort of the cutting edge of the neoliberal countries. We need to have these debates within democratic fora urgently, because if we don't, something quite appalling is going to happen. And that's not just relevant to AI, it's relevant to gene editing, it's relevant to cellular agriculture, etc., etc. And again, my worry is, Danny Finkelstein's talking about 1917. We need to be talking about what does AI do to the labour market? Clearly, if you've got access as a worker to some personal AI that I don't, you're going to be able to get jobs that I can never get. And it's worrying.
Which is even worse with gene editing, right?
Yeah, well, gene editing, I think gene editing and AI that could create massive asymmetries in the labour market. And something like an Elon Musk, he's an idiot when it comes to building underground maglev trains which turn out just to be tunnels, but at least he's talking about the moral issues surrounding artificial intelligence in the labour market. I mean, for him it's just a kind of joke because he's worth $20 billion, but it's something we need to be talking about. And I'd be very worried about machine control of societies. However, I'll finish on this. However, we've been having conversations. Fundamentally, the state has had it's exercised control over life and death. The state itself is a technology which can take life, it can murder people or deprive them of their freedom. That's not new. And so how do we try and deal with that, mitigate risk? We created a separation of powers. We had polyarchies in society where you have different concentrations of power, often in tension with one another. We stopped monopolies, etc., etc. So I think we probably have similar solutions with regards to artificial intelligence. Maybe you'd want a distribution of artificial intelligence, so many that you couldn't get the rise of an all-powerful one, etc., etc. But these are issues for moral philosophers. These are issues for. I haven't got that training as a moral philosopher, but they're very relevant arguments. We're not discussing them because we have a ruling class fixated with the past and not the future.
They're not just issues for philosophers, though. They're issues for political economists in the sense of how is power concentrated, how is power divided.
Political philosophers as well.
How do you stop tyranny, either of the market or the machine, or the government in a sort of illiberal society or whatever? I mean, do you think in this transition to Falk or within Falk, do you think you've dealt with political economy in that respect enough? And I think that is one place where. The reason I ask is because I think this is where communist movements and communist theory has often failed. It hasn't seen how power can concentrate outside of the market, or if you try and have some kind of democracy which is somewhat more radical than liberal democracy.
Well, I'm not proposing that though, and you've been,
Well, that's what it's clear. You're not. I'm not sure what you are proposing on a political level, other than social democratic reforms.
Well, yeah, the near-term stuff. I mean, ultimately, it's I could have made it a much longer book. What's going to happen over the next 1,000 years.
Yeah.
That wasn't my interest, because I want to talk about the crises we're undergoing and how that's an existential threat to capitalism. There's no standing still, right? It's not fully automated luxury communism or the same. Things are going to dramatically change very quickly. The question is, in whose interests? I want to say the future is already here, and it's unfolding remarkably quickly. And as somebody on the left, I want to say, okay, well, what do we do next? That's what I'm interested in. As Marx says, philosophers have interpreted the world, the point is to change it. So the final third of the book is how do we change the world, given what I've just said. Now, clearly, you want far more, you want other books. You want to start a whole other conversation about, yes, the political philosophy, what's legitimate state authority under conditions of an all-powerful AI, etc. Political philosophers and moral philosophers haven't been more relevant for hundreds of years, right? Because we have these new structural problems we need to engage with as societies. But that's beyond the remit of the book. I'm very open and honest about what this book is trying to address.
All right, let's do final question. This is within the remit of the book, but it's also very big. I like it. Daniel Eden, would Falk cure death? And would that be a good thing? Do you want to live for as long as you like? So there is a chapter on gene editing which does sort of mention the fact that potentially this new technology could cure aging.
Yeah.
And obviously if we can cure aging, we can presumably prevent the onset of death. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of research around aging. And there are people that are now saying we need to treat age as an illness, not as an inevitability. And the book talks about, so the leading causes of death in 1900 worldwide were infection, pneumonia, influenza, etc. Today, the leading causes of death are age-related: cancer, stroke, heart disease, dementia. And so one argument could be, well, you can keep healthcare costs super low if you can stop aging, which is true in a sense. You probably could, actually. You could probably have 99% health savings between gene editing and stopping aging, etc. Would we want to, is one question. Secondly, is the human brain. So even if you could stop aging for the human organism as it stands, we think that there's a cap really on the human brain of about 120, 130 years.
Oh, wow.
Which is
so you can't gene edit away the aging of the brain? You
may be able to remove stem cells, edit the stem cells, put them back in there, but fundamentally that's the organism that will struggle. And there's some work on this. There's a crazy guy, I want to interview him, Aubrey de Grey. There's some talk about this, and there are some organisms out there that don't age. Sponges don't age.
But they don't have brains, presumably.
Sponges are very different organisms to human beings, precisely.
Do lobsters not age?
I think they do.
I thought that was maybe in your book, but maybe that's somewhere else that
I think you're thinking of Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, but no, his is. I don't think he involves them not aging. Where did I see this? Oh, I think this was on a video after I was reading about gene editing in your book. I watched a YouTube video about it, obviously.
Right.
And lobsters came up.
Right.
I have to look that up afterwards.
I mean, there are mammals that live a lot longer than we do, right? Turtles and tortoises and so on. Do I think that humans could live a lot longer because of technological change? Probably, yeah, probably.
But not forever, because you think the brain is going to have a limit.
Well, again, it's a moral question. It's a moral question, and that again, it's beyond the purview of the book.
Oh, Gary McQuiggan's saying he told me about the lobsters, so credit to Gary if that's true, and blame Gary if it's false. I think we should call it a day. I mean, all of these issues are going to be forming the basis of lots of Novara content over the coming years, over the coming weeks, over the coming months, over the coming years. I mean, maybe, as they have for the last 4 years.
Maybe that's where I could do the sequel for the book. Is like Fully Automated Luxury Communism 2. We've gone beyond work. We've gone beyond scarcity. Now we're going to go beyond death. Exactly.
Yeah. But are we going to have elections? Are we going to have barbers who are paid with money? Yeah,
we would.
We would.
I mean, in the interim period,
that's the interim period, isn't it?
Yeah, but I'm not here to write recipes.
You're not here to write recipes for the future, right?
But I think that word communism has has a genuine meaning in terms of with the arrival of general artificial intelligence in a way that it really never has had before. Because if you look at renewable energies, you're looking at potentially limitless forms of energy. Yeah. And you're looking at potentially limitless forms of cognitive labour. It clearly attenuates key features of the capitalist mode of production.
And because this is I suppose your main argument is this is the first time we as a human society are going to have to deal with abundance.
Yeah.
And that's why what you want is communism.
Yeah.
I'm all right with it. Thank you so much, Aaron.
Pleasure.
Get the book. Read the book. It is very good. Very readable. And I learned a lot about gene editing. I learned a lot about these different meats that we can grow in tanks. I'm looking forward to the chicken being brewed.
Yeah.
And I mean, the one thing that worried me was the idea that if you find an asteroid that there was one particular asteroid that you wanted to mine it by bringing it closer to the Earth, and I didn't like that idea. So I feel like these asteroids, maybe leave them far away.
Yeah.
But
that may be the most efficient way of doing it, right? So rather than taking things A to B,
yeah, just don't bring it too close. Is what I'm saying.
Bring it closer.
Anyway, thank you so much for watching. As you know, this show is only possible because of your kind support. So please, if you haven't already, go to support.novaramedia.com. Donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Like this video, share this video. Keep your comments coming. We always enjoy them. We'll see you the same time, same place next week.